Danielle Harper had just buried her brother, Anthony, under a cloud of unanswered questions. 15 minutes later, she was lying dead in a pool of blood outside a law office, silenced before she could expose the truth that got them both killed. Danielle. Harper stood motionless beside the open grave, her black heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. The crowd had started to thin, quiet murmurs, giving way to the distant hum of cars on the nearby road. The priest had already said his final words, and the casket had been lowered. Yet Danielle lingered. Her eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, remained fixed on the headstone now bearing her brother's name, Anthony Harper. Only 3 days earlier, he had been alive, texting her about dinner plans. Now, he was gone. Just like that. The funeral had been hastily arranged, but the turnout was larger than expected. Anthony was a known figure in the town of Milford, Georgia, a successful contractor who had built homes for half the people attending the service. He was also freshly divorced, with no children and only one living relative, Danielle. She hadn't spoken to him daily, but their bond was tight. They had grown up close after their parents died in a house fire when Danielle was only 16. Anthony had practically raised her. Losing him felt like losing everything she had left of her family. The official story was that Anthony's truck had spun off the highway and collided with a tree. No drugs or alcohol were found in his system. The brakes were reportedly damaged, and the crash was ruled accidental. But Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Anthony was a cautious driver, especially after the divorce. He wasn't the kind of man to speed recklessly down a country road. Danielle had voiced her concerns to the police, but they brushed her off, noting the worn brake lines and suggesting poor maintenance. Still, her instincts told her this was no accident. As she stared at the fresh soil, memories played in her mind like faded film reels. Anthony teaching her to ride a bike, him helping her move into her college dorm, him crying at their parents' funeral but pretending not to. Now she was burying him, and the pain of it didn't feel real. Around her, the remaining mourners exchanged hugs and condolences. Old neighbors, business partners, and some clients from Anthony's contracting firm had come. One of them, a man named Ben Calloway, had kept his distance during the ceremony. Danielle had noticed. Ben and Anthony had been business partners up until a few months ago when they suddenly split. Anthony never told her the full story, but she remembered him being unusually tense, complaining about missing funds and shady invoices. Then came the lawsuit, which Anthony claimed would fix everything. Danielle hadn't thought much of it until now. With Anthony gone, the lawsuit was likely to die with him. She glanced down at the program in her hand. It was simple. Anthony's name, his birth and death dates, and a quote beneath it that read, "You build your legacy one brick at a time." He had lived by that motto. A builder, a fixer, not someone whose life should have ended broken against a tree trunk. Danielle checked her watch. She had an appointment with Anthony's lawyer in just over an hour. Hillman & Sons law firm had called her 2 days after Anthony's death, requesting a meeting to go over estate details. She was named as his sole beneficiary, something she hadn't known until they contacted her. It made sense, but the timing felt strange. Too fast, too convenient. She made her way toward her car, parked at the edge of the cemetery. As she walked, she noticed Iris Mark standing alone by a nearby bench. Iris was Anthony's ex-wife. Their marriage had ended bitterly after years of financial disputes and trust issues. Iris looked gaunt, her eyes sunken, her lips tight. She didn't approach Danielle, didn't offer condolences. They simply exchanged a glance, brief, cold, loaded with history, before Danielle turned away. Sliding into her car, Danielle took a deep breath. The smell of her brother's cologne lingered faintly on the leather seat, a leftover from the last time he'd ridden with her. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening. She had questions, too many to count, and she wasn't going to let grief stop her from finding answers. The drive to the law firm was short, about 10 minutes through winding suburban roads and sleepy commercial streets. Milford wasn't a big town. It was the kind of place where people waved at you from porches where the mailman knew your name. But behind the small-town charm, Danielle now saw something more sinister. Secrets, lies, the kind that could be buried deep and left to rot. She pulled into the parking lot of Hillman & Sons and parked beside a large black SUV. It looked familiar, but she didn't dwell on it. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her dress. The building in front of her was a 2-story brick structure with ivy crawling up one side. She had barely taken 3 steps toward the entrance when she felt something strange, a chill, a tingle down her spine. She paused, turned slightly, looked around. Nothing. Just cars, a few people in the distance, and the warm Georgia sun. She reached into her purse for Anthony's documents, insurance forms, bank details, and the letter from the lawyer. When a sharp sound cut through the air like lightning, it happened so fast, no one saw where it came from. Danielle's body hit the pavement before she even realized she'd been shot. The parking lot turned chaotic in seconds. A woman screamed. Someone called 911. Others ducked, unsure if more shots would follow. The shooter had already vanished, disappearing between vehicles like a shadow in broad daylight. Danielle lay motionless on the ground, blood blooming on her chest. Just 15 minutes after burying her brother, she had joined him in death. A single shot, no words, no warning. A brutal end to a day that had already been soaked in grief. Milford would remember that day forever. Not for the funeral, not for the flowers, not for the tears, but for what followed. The Harper family's final chapter had begun not in silence, but in gunfire. And the mystery of why Danielle died and who pulled the trigger was only just beginning. The police sirens cut through the quiet like a blade, reaching the scene in under 4 minutes. The call had been made by a paralegal inside Hillman & Sons, who saw Danielle collapse just outside the office window. At first, she thought it was a fainting spell, maybe exhaustion or stress. But then she saw the blood. Paramedics arrived moments later, attempting to revive Danielle Harper, but the damage was done. A single bullet had entered her chest, puncturing a lung and stopping her heart within seconds. She was pronounced dead on the scene, her body still warm when the sheet was pulled over her. The entire block was cordoned off within minutes. A crime scene had formed where just a funeral had taken place less than an hour earlier. It was as if death had followed Danielle from the cemetery. Yellow tape lined the parking lot. Officers moved quickly, interviewing witnesses, checking for cameras, and marking the ground for bullet casings. But the shooter had vanished. It was a clean hit, fast and precise. No one had seen a face. Only a few vague descriptions emerged. A tall figure, dark clothing, possibly male, running east toward the alley. Detective Ellen Briggs took charge of the investigation. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, and no stranger to violent crimes. But this one felt different. The timing, the target, the location, it all suggested planning. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing was stolen. No altercation had occurred. Danielle had simply stepped out of her car and was gunned down in broad daylight. The law firm staff was visibly shaken. Danielle had been expected for a 12 p.m. appointment to review her brother's estate. She had called earlier that morning to confirm. A folder with her name on it still sat unopened on the conference room table. According to the lawyer, Anthony Harper had left behind a detailed will naming Danielle as the sole heir. The estate was valued at nearly $500,000, mostly in property, vehicles, and a recently updated life insurance policy. It was clear Danielle was about to come into a significant amount of money. That detail made the murder look, lot less random. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store offered the first real lead. In the top corner of the video, a black SUV was seen idling in the parking lot at 11:35 a.m., 5 minutes before the shooting. At 11:41, Danielle arrived in her sedan. 30 seconds later, a figure emerged from behind the SUV, quickly crossed behind another car, and approached her. The figure raised their arm and Danielle dropped. The shooter then ran out of frame. The footage was grainy and the shooter wore a cap and mask, concealing their identity. But the SUV, that was something the police could track. The license plate was partially obscured, but enough numbers were visible for DMV records to narrow it down. The SUV was registered to a security company owned by Benjamin Calloway. That name immediately raised flags for the detectives. Benjamin had been Anthony Harper's former business partner. The two had run Harper and Calloway Construction together, until a bitter fallout 6 months earlier. Anthony had accused Benjamin of embezzling funds from their joint accounts. A civil lawsuit had been filed, but no criminal charges were ever brought. Now both men were dead, one from a supposed accident, the other gunned down before she could claim the inheritance. Detectives requested access to Benjamin's financials, but red tape slowed the process. Instead, they turned their attention to the people closest to Anthony. At the top of that list was Iris Marks, Anthony's ex-wife. Danielle had listed her in a private folder on her laptop under a heading labeled Risk. It wasn't much to go on, but the police followed up. Anyway, Iris was found at her apartment, clearly shaken when told about Danielle's murder. She claimed to have been home all morning, and her story was backed by a neighbor who saw her walking her dog around the time of the shooting. Still, her name remained on the list. Her relationship with Anthony had been toxic, and there had been recent legal disputes over alimony payments that Anthony had fallen behind on. But even with motive, there was no evidence she'd been near the law office that morning. While police dug through Danielle's emails and files, a new discovery pushed the case in an unexpected direction. On Danielle's phone was a recent recording, dated 2 days before Anthony's funeral. In it, she narrated a message to herself, saying she didn't believe her brother's death was an accident. She mentioned a feeling of being watched and said she believed someone was following her car. The final part of the recording mentioned her intention to meet with the lawyers and get everything officially in writing, a phrase that now echoed with eerie finality. Danielle hadn't just been going to claim her inheritance. She was preparing for something. She knew there was danger and was trying to protect herself. Unfortunately, she had no idea how close the danger already was. Detectives began pulling more footage from traffic cams around the law office. One clip from a nearby ATM captured a clearer shot of the suspect's getaway, not the shooter, but the vehicle used to escape. The black SUV turned down a side street just minutes after the attack, and the camera caught a better angle of the license plate. This time, they got the full number. The SUV was indeed linked to Calloway Security Solutions, the same company Benjamin Calloway still managed. Records showed the vehicle had been signed out that morning by an employee named Marcus Dillard, a former Marine turned private contractor with a checkered past. He had a minor criminal record for assault during a bar fight and had worked with Benjamin for the last 2 years as a personal driver and security detail. Police now had a real suspect and a possible link between the shooter and the man who had the most to gain from Anthony and Danielle's deaths. The net was starting to tighten. Danielle Harper's murder was no longer just a tragedy. It was the centerpiece of a calculated plot, one stretching back months, maybe longer. And now, with one of the key pieces of evidence pointing directly to a man tied to both deaths, detectives had a target in their sights. But they still didn't have the gun. They didn't have a confession. And most importantly, they didn't know who had pulled the trigger. Danielle had been silenced, but The truth she died for was starting to rise piece by piece, and it was ready to speak for her. Inside the evidence room at the Milford Police Department, Detective Ellen Briggs stood over a desk covered in reports, photographs, and digital files. The threads were beginning to pull together. Danielle's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was part of something planned, something layered. There were too many coincidences, too many overlapping motives. Briggs knew from experience that when money and betrayal mixed with grief, murder often followed. But she also knew something else. Real killers were rarely the ones standing in plain sight. The SUV used in the shooting had been traced to Callaway Security Solutions. The employee who had signed it out, Marcus Dillard, became the investigation's primary suspect. He had military experience, firearms training, and a criminal past. He also had a close, long-term association with Benjamin Callaway, Anthony Harper's former business partner. Detectives brought Marcus in for questioning, and though he didn't confess, he didn't lawyer up either. His answers were mechanical, tight, and devoid of emotion. He claimed the SUV was borrowed for a personal errand and denied knowing anything about Danielle Harper. But a security camera from the side of a bank building caught a partial reflection in a glass window. Someone matching Marcus's build and wearing the same brand of tactical boots as seen on his social media posts, standing in the law firm parking lot less than a minute before the murder. The image wasn't enough to arrest him, but it raised serious questions. Meanwhile, a new clue emerged in a place no one expected: Anthony Harper's backyard. After Anthony's death, his house had been locked up, waiting for legal transfer. The property was being cleaned by a maintenance crew when one of the workers discovered an old metal lockbox buried behind the garden shed. It had been rusted, shut, but inside were water-damaged papers, a flash drive, and a phone. Anthony's second phone, one not found in his belongings at the time of death. The phone had survived despite the damage. With the help of digital forensics, parts of the device were recovered. What they found shifted the entire investigation. The text history revealed a series of cryptic conversations between Anthony and Danielle over the past 2 months. In these messages, Anthony detailed suspicions about Benjamin embezzling money through dummy contracts and shell invoices. He believed over $300,000 had been moved into off-the-books accounts and hinted that he had begun compiling evidence for authorities. One message read, "He thinks I don't know, but I've been watching the numbers. I'll turn everything over next week." Then the messages abruptly stopped. 3 days later, Anthony was dead. Alongside the messages were emails, all drafts that had never been sent. In them, Anthony had outlined a timeline of financial discrepancies in their joint business. He had kept the documents and notes offline, stored on the flash drive in the lockbox. The drive contained scans of invoices, bank transfers, and client contracts, all pointing to a pattern of money being siphoned out of Harper and Callaway Construction over a span of 6 months. The recipient accounts led to a business registered in Alabama under the name B. Callaway Holdings. This was the first time Benjamin's fingerprints appeared directly on anything suspicious. Detective Briggs presented the findings to the Financial Crimes Division, who began digging into the Alabama records. What they uncovered painted a clear picture. Benjamin had created a fake consulting company to funnel stolen funds from his business partnership with Anthony. The money had been rerouted through various channels, but the original account was opened just weeks before Anthony first raised suspicions about internal theft. Benjamin's motive had been financial, but what made everything worse was timing. According to the documents in Anthony's possession, he had been preparing to go public. Danielle had known. She had started connecting the dots herself after her brother's crash. She must have realized the car accident wasn't just an accident. That's why she made the recording on her phone and began contacting lawyers. She wasn't just collecting her brother's inheritance, she was chasing answers. With these revelations, police returned to Marcus Dillard. They confronted him with the timeline, the texts, the surveillance footage, and most importantly, the buried phone. Under pressure, Marcus began to unravel. At first, he denied involvement again. But after 8 hours of questioning, he finally cracked. Marcus admitted to being at the law firm on the day of Danielle's murder. He said he was sent there by someone he worked for, someone who told him to make sure the girl doesn't go inside. According to Marcus, he was told to scare her, to stop her, not kill her. He insisted he didn't know the gun would be loaded. He said he thought it would be a warning shot, something theatrical to buy more time. But when the weapon fired and Danielle fell, he ran. He never saw her face. It was a confession, partial but damning. Police now had a direct link between Marcus and the murder, and circumstantial evidence that pointed the finger directly at Benjamin Calloway. They secured a warrant and raided Benjamin's office and home. There, hidden behind a false wall panel. In his garage, they found a safe containing multiple IDs, burner phones, stacks of cash, and another flash drive containing more financial records. These matched Anthony's original files. Benjamin had clearly been covering his tracks for months, preparing for the day when everything might fall apart. Still, Benjamin remained silent when arrested. He refused to answer questions, demanded a lawyer, and denied knowing anything about Danielle's murder. But the evidence was overwhelming. His financial crimes, combined with the forensic trail from Anthony's buried phone and Marcus's confession, told a story of motive, opportunity, and orchestration. The town of Milford watched as the trial drew near. What began as a tragic accident had evolved into a tangled conspiracy involving fraud, betrayal, and a carefully planned murder. Danielle Harper had been so close to uncovering the truth. She had attended her brother's funeral carrying more than grief. She carried evidence, suspicion, and determination. And it cost her life. But the case wasn't over yet. Prosecutors would need to build their argument carefully. Benjamin hadn't pulled the trigger. He hadn't even been on the scene, but they believed he had set everything in motion, from the moment Anthony confronted him to the moment Danielle stepped out of her car. Now, with the pieces finally falling into place, the justice Danielle died chasing was inching closer. What? She couldn't say in her final moments the evidence she left behind would say for her. The walls around Benjamin Calloway were closing in, and the truth Anthony tried to expose was finally catching up with its architect. The courthouse was buzzing with quiet intensity. Reporters lined the steps, photographers angled their cameras, and whispers of the Harper case floated through the crowd. Inside, the mood was heavy. The murder of Danielle Harper had captivated the town of Milford and beyond, not just because it was tragic, but because it was so calculated. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next, and whether Benjamin Calloway, the man who had once built homes with Anthony Harper, would now be held responsible for tearing their family apart. Benjamin sat at the defense table, flanked by two high-priced attorneys. He looked calm, his hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. From the outside, he appeared like a businessman caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the evidence told a much darker story. The prosecution laid it all out: financial fraud, a suspicious car crash, a second phone buried behind a shed, a shooting in broad daylight, and a confession from a man who claimed to be working under Benjamin's direction. Marcus Dillard's testimony was the center of the case. On the stand, he wore a wrinkled suit and avoided eye contact with the jury. He recounted how he'd worked for Benjamin for 2 years, handling everything from security to errands. He said Benjamin had called him a week before Danielle's murder, asking if he could do a job that involved making sure someone didn't go through with a legal meeting. Marcus said he thought it was just to intimidate her, not kill her. But then Benjamin handed him the weapon, a gun Marcus claimed he believed was loaded with blanks. The courtroom held its breath as he described the moment he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Danielle dropped instantly. He didn't wait to see the outcome. He ran, panicked, and drove the SUV to a back alley before switching vehicles and leaving town for the night. When he saw the news later that day, he realized the truth. Danielle had died. The woman he thought he was only meant to scare had bled out on the pavement. Cross-examination tried to poke holes in Marcus's story. The defense argued that he was lying to save himself, that he acted alone, and that Benjamin never ordered anything. But his timeline matched surveillance footage. Phone records showed several calls between him and Benjamin in the days leading up to the murder. And most damning of all, Benjamin's fingerprints were found on the envelope of cash in Marcus's apartment. Cash marked with serial numbers, tied to one of Benjamin's shell companies. Then came the financial evidence. The prosecution presented a complex but convincing breakdown of the money trail that Anthony Harper had uncovered before his death. Multiple business accounts had been drained through phony consulting contracts. Funds had been funneled into B. Calloway Holdings, a company that didn't even have a functioning office. There was no staff, no product, no service. It existed only to hide the money. And Anthony had known. He had compiled emails, records, and voice memos onto a flash drive, stored with a backup phone that he buried in his yard, clearly fearing that someone was watching him. The accident that killed Anthony now looked less like an accident and more like a warning gone too far. The brakes on his truck were damaged, but not in the usual way. A mechanic brought in by the police testified that the failure appeared intentional, something a skilled hand would do to cause gradual brake loss over time. Not enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but enough to cause a crash if left unnoticed. Danielle, in the days after Anthony's death, had picked up the trail. Her phone recordings, found later, showed a clear progression of her suspicions. She mentioned Benjamin by name. She spoke of feeling watched. She had even made copies of some of Anthony's files and was planning to hand them over to her attorney. She never made it to the meeting. All of it, the fraud, the crash, the shooting, formed a chain of events. Danielle hadn't just stumbled into danger. She had walked straight into it, trying to finish what her brother had started. Benjamin, according to the prosecutors, orchestrated everything. He had motive, access, and the right people under his influence. He didn't need to pull the trigger. He just needed to make sure others did the work. The defense stuck to their narrative. There was no direct proof Benjamin ordered the murder. No email, no text, no recording. Just circumstantial evidence and a desperate man's word. Marcus's word. They claimed the money issues were a business dispute, that Anthony's death was a tragic accident, and that Danielle's murder was an act of violence from someone else, perhaps even a person who wanted the inheritance for themselves. But each counterpoint felt weaker as more details surfaced. A forensic accountant took the stand and explained how Benjamin had altered spreadsheets to cover missing funds, and how Danielle's digital trail showed she had been gathering those files on her own. She wasn't a passive heir. She'd been actively investigating and pushing forward the very lawsuit that Benjamin wanted buried. In a final surprise, the prosecution revealed a letter that Anthony had written to Danielle days before his death. It had never been sent, but it was found in the drawer of his desk. In the letter, Anthony told Danielle to be careful. He wrote that if anything happened to him, she should take the documents to the authorities immediately and never trust Benjamin again. He ended the note with a warning. There are people who would rather see us dead than exposed. The courtroom fell silent as the letter was read aloud. It was the emotional weight the prosecution needed. The jury listened closely. The letter, the testimony, the buried phone, it all pointed to one conclusion. Benjamin Calloway sat still, his face a blank wall. But inside the jury room, a decision was already forming. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Guilty on All counts: conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, accessory to homicide. Benjamin Calloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps. Some wept, others nodded solemnly. The Harper siblings were gone, but the truth they tried to expose had finally seen the light. Detective Briggs watched from the back, arms folded. She'd seen dozens of cases in her career, but this one stayed with her. Not just because of the tragedy, but because of the bravery Danielle showed in her final days. She had walked into danger knowing the risks. She didn't stop. She didn't run. Justice had been delayed. But in the end, it had arrived. Milford would remember the Harpers for their determination, for the legacy they left behind. A legacy not of wealth or buildings, but of courage. One that would echo long after the courtroom emptied. 2 months had passed since the verdict was delivered. The town of Milford had slowly begun returning to its quiet routines, but nothing felt quite the same. The Harper siblings, once fixtures in the community, were now names etched on matching headstones beneath a tall oak tree in St. Luke's Cemetery. People still paused at their graves. Some left flowers. Others just stood in silence. The story that unfolded in the weeks following their deaths had left a deep imprint, one marked by betrayal, bravery, and a search for truth that came at the highest cost. Danielle Harper's apartment remained untouched for several days after the trial. It was her best friend, Maria Eldridge, who finally entered the space. Guided by a key Danielle had left her in case of emergency. The apartment was modest, clean, and filled with reminders of a life interrupted, half-read books, coffee mugs with lipstick stains, and sticky notes lined with scribbled to-do lists. On her desk sat a sealed envelope addressed simply as "To be opened if anything happens." It had been overlooked during the initial search by police and only now resurfaced. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Danielle, written 4 days before her death. In it, she detailed her fears, her suspicions, and her plan to meet with the lawyer to transfer Anthony's estate while quietly handing over evidence. She believed someone was watching her, though she wasn't sure who. The letter ended with a single sentence that seemed to echo across time. "If I don't make it through this, tell them I never stopped trying." Maria handed the letter to Detective Ellen Briggs, who had remained involved even after the conviction. Briggs had built a career on difficult cases, but something about this one stayed with her. It wasn't just the calculated nature of the crimes, it was the spirit of the victims. Anthony and Danielle had not been perfect people, but they were honest. They had tried to do the right thing, even when it meant standing against someone powerful, someone they once trusted. As the weeks moved on, new details continued to emerge. Forensic techs uncovered that Anthony's original lawsuit, thought to be halted after his death, had actually been filed twice. The second version, heavily redacted, had been sent to a confidential third-party legal fund just days before the car crash. This group, a watchdog organization for financial crimes, had preserved the evidence. Danielle must have known about this, which explained why she had been so determined to get to the law office. The revelation reignited interest at the state level. Auditors opened up new investigations into Benjamin Calloway's past contracts, uncovering more cases of financial misappropriation. He had used the same shell company technique in 3 different states, going back almost a decade. The Harper case had triggered a domino effect. More victims came forward, more lawsuits were filed, and Benjamin, already serving life without parole, faced a growing mountain of civil penalties. The fallout extended further. Marcus Dillard, the man who pulled the trigger, agreed to testify in the new cases in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy, sentenced to 25 years with the possibility of parole. In court, he apologized, not only to the judge, but to the memory of Danielle Harper. He said he never intended to kill her, but admitted that he allowed himself to be used by a man who saw people as disposable. His remorse felt genuine, but it couldn't undo the damage. As the justice system ground forward, the town of Milford began to make changes of its own. A memorial scholarship was created in the Harper siblings' name, funded anonymously by a group of local business owners who had once worked with Anthony. The scholarship focused on students studying criminal justice, journalism, or law, fields where truth and integrity mattered. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant the Harpers wouldn't be forgotten. The law firm where Danielle was killed installed a permanent plaque near the parking lot entrance. It read simply, "In memory of Danielle Harper, who sought justice in the face of fear." Beneath it, a small flower bed was planted, tended by volunteers who never met her but felt connected to her story. Detective Briggs, now back to her usual caseload, still kept the Harper file on a separate shelf in her office. She'd gone through it dozens of times, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she wanted to remember how close the truth had come to being buried forever. If Danielle hadn't followed her instincts, if Anthony hadn't taken the time to gather evidence, the whole case would have disappeared into paperwork and unasked questions. Briggs used it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest suspicions are the ones worth chasing. One chilly afternoon in early spring, Briggs visited St. Luke's Cemetery alone. She brought 2 sunflowers, Danielle's favorite, according to Maria, and laid one at each headstone. The wind stirred the tall grass, and for a long while, she just stood there, letting the silence settle around her. Behind her, life in Milford continued. Children played on sidewalks. Cars passed by slowly. The world had moved on, but not without change. There would be no more updates, no more revelations. The story had reached its end, but it would remain, whispered in classrooms, retold in late-night conversations, revisited every time someone asked how a brother and sister ended up side by side in matching graves. Danielle Harper had attended her brother's funeral, hoping to close one chapter and begin a new one. Instead, she became a chapter of her own, an unfinished story that demanded to be completed, no matter the cost. And in the end, she got what she was looking for. Not peace. Not reward, but truth, and sometimes that's the only justice the dead can ask for.